Imagine for a moment that someone gently places back into your hands something you thought you had lost forever. Not an object, but an entire time of your life. A time you may remember in the quiet minutes of early morning, when the coffee is still warm and the house feels bigger than it really is. A time when the streets were calmer, the voices softer, and families carried small rituals that somehow kept the world from falling apart. I speak of this time because sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can feel it calling me back. Perhaps you feel it too, that soft tug in the chest, like a door from the past slightly cracked open, and you know that with just a gentle push you could return to a day that seemed ordinary, yet was filled with all the meaning life would later reveal. And what if I told you that we're about to step through that door together? I want you to come with me now, slowly, breathing deeply as if preparing to enter an old house where every corner preserves a piece of who we once were. Because right now, as you listen, we are returning to the 1950s, not as curious tourists, but as someone finally coming home. I remember it as if it were yesterday. The morning began with a kind of silence that no longer exists. The silence of a world before the digital age, where every sound had texture, the crackling of the radio before a song began, the wind brushing against a wooden fence, the faint rumble of the milk truck down the street. Even the smells of that era were different. There was something of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the scent of a just-opened newspaper, and that faint, sweet aroma of polished wooden furniture. The light that came through the window had a warm, golden tint, as if the sun back then was kinder, less rushed across the sky. There were no screens, no notifications, no artificial urgencies. There was only time, full, slow, undivided time. And inside that time lived the family rituals that now feel almost mythic. Rituals many have forgotten. Perhaps you have too, yet somehow they still remain alive in the quiet rooms of memory. Do you recall that feeling? When the world felt bigger, yet somehow more intimate? When people owned fewer things, but everything seemed to matter more? When gestures were simple but carried a sincerity we rarely see today? This is what I want you to feel now. The return of something that vanished quietly. Something modern life swept away before we had the chance to hold on to it. As I walk through these memories, I notice something shifting inside me. My breath slows, my mind softens, my shoulders ease. It's as if the memories of the 1950s have the power to remind us of who we were before the rushing world swallowed us whole. And perhaps that is what you came here for, not just nostalgia, but a reunion with yourself. I can almost sense your reaction from here. Maybe your chest loosened a little. Maybe an old image surfaced. A kitchen with a checkered floor, a wooden table worn by years of hands and elbows, the sound of your mother whisking eggs in a metal bowl. Or maybe the image of your father adjusting the radio dial, searching for the evening news. Whatever memory appeared, it came for a reason, and I promise you, we will honor it. Together, we will walk through the family rituals that shaped life in the 1950s, not as dusty traditions from a forgotten past, but as emotional gateways to a time when life had pauses, textures, scents, and silence. Rituals that shaped entire generations and still echo quietly within us, buried beneath decades of change. Take a slow breath. Our journey has only begun, and I will guide you step by step back to the one thing modern life could never erase, the memory of what truly matters. When I look back now, the first thing that returns to me about the 1950s is the mornings. Not the events, not the conversations, but the feeling of mornings. You know, those slow openings of the day, when the world seemed to stretch awake instead of jerking into motion the way it does now. There was a softness to everything, a patience, almost as if time itself knew it didn't need to hurry. I can still hear the sounds that lived in those early hours. The low hum of a refrigerator that always seemed a little louder than it should be, the soft rattle of dishes being moved in the kitchen, the faint thump of footsteps on old wooden floors, steady, familiar, comforting. And there was always the radio, that crackling, imperfect companion that announced the beginning of every day. Before televisions glowed in every living room, before screens became our windows to the world, the radio was a quiet heartbeat in the home. A soft voice reading the news, or a singer's warm melody blending with the aroma of breakfast. The kitchen was the true stage of morning rituals. The 1950s kitchen wasn't just a place to prepare food, it was the warm center of the home, the anchor that held the family in orbit. I remember the cold touch of the linoleum floor first thing in the morning, the way it made my feet curl for a moment before they adjusted. I remember the texture of the wooden chairs, slightly rough, always cool to the touch, pulled out from the table with a familiar scrape. And most of all, I remember the smells: crispy bacon in the pan, butter melting on toast, fresh oranges being squeezed, and coffee, always coffee, filling every corner of the house with its deep, earthy scent. Breakfast wasn't rushed. No one grabbed food on their way out the door. No one checked the time compulsively. The morning meal was a ritual of grounding, of gathering. Families sat together, not out of obligation, but because that's simply what people did. It was the unspoken rule of life. You begin the day with your loved ones, and by being together, the world somehow made sense. And there was something else, something I've only come to appreciate now, looking back with older eyes. Mornings carried a sense of reassurance. The kind of reassurance you can't buy, can't recreate, can't download. It was born from routine, from the quiet repetition of small, meaningful actions. The rhythmic whisking of eggs, the clink of a spoon stirring sugar into a cup, the soft laughter drifting in from the hallway, the sunlight creeping across the table inch by inch, warming the room with its tender glow. In those moments, you didn't think about the passing of time. You didn't worry about bills, deadlines, messages, or the endless noise of the modern world. You simply existed, fully, completely, in the present. And perhaps that's why so many older people today feel a kind of ache when they think back to the 1950s. Because those mornings were more than just routines. They were rituals of belonging, rituals that whispered, "You are home, you are safe. This moment matters." Even today, if I close my eyes long enough, I can see it clearly. My mother placing a plate on the table with a gentleness that never seemed forced. My father tightening the knot of his tie while humming an old tune. The soft warmth of the stove, the smell of toast rising into the air like a memory made visible. Tell me, do you remember mornings like that? Maybe you can almost feel the coolness of your childhood kitchen or picture the face of someone who used to call you to the table. Maybe a sound from your past is echoing faintly in your mind right now. A kettle whistling, a chair creaking, someone laughing softly. These moments, simple as they were, shaped us. They taught us rhythm, patience, and gratitude long before we could name those things. They were the quiet foundation of a world that felt whole. And now, as we revisit these rituals together, I want you to hold these memories close. Not as relics of a distant past, but as living pieces of your story, fragments of the life you once knew and perhaps still long for. Because in the 1950s, mornings weren't just the start of another day. They were an invitation, a gentle reminder that life begins slowly, softly, and beautifully. If there is something I miss most about the 1950s, it isn't the objects, or the inventions, or even the culture. It's the togetherness, that subtle, unspoken art of being present with other people. Back then, being together didn't require planning or screens or reminders. It simply happened, like breathing, like the rising and setting of the sun. And perhaps you remember this too. The way the living room slowly came alive after breakfast, as if the house itself inhaled and stretched its arms. It wasn't a place for decoration or display. It was a place for existence, a place where people sat not to escape the world, but to inhabit it more deeply. I can still picture the soft, muted glow of the lamps, not bright white LEDs, but warm bulbs that filled the room with that honey-colored light. Gentle, imperfect, comforting. You could always see the dust floating lazily through the air when the sun angled just right, like tiny memories suspended in time. And the furniture, well, it had its own personality. The couches were firm, the fabric slightly rough, but there was a kind of security in that firmness. It was the kind of furniture that made you sit upright, attentive, present, as if inviting you to actually participate in the moment instead of sinking away from it. Afternoons were slow, not empty, slow. A kind of slowness that allowed life to reveal itself inch by inch, instead of rushing past in a blur. I remember the sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the house. You never really noticed it, but you felt it, like a faint pulse in the background. It was steady, honest. A reminder that time was passing, yes, but not slipping away. Time back then felt like a companion, a patient one, who walked beside you instead of running ahead. Sometimes someone would sit by the window, not to look at anything in particular, but simply to be there, to feel the breeze through the screen, to watch a neighbor walk by, to allow the world to move at its natural pace. Today we call that mindfulness. Back then, it was just called living. And families. They had a way of being close without always speaking. There was a kind of emotional gravity pulling everyone gently toward one another, especially in those quiet afternoon hours. A father reading the newspaper, a mother sewing or folding laundry, a child playing with a simple wooden toy on the carpet. No one was distracted. No one was elsewhere. Everyone was here, in the same room, the same moment, the same unspoken rhythm. And this rhythm, this tender, invisible thread weaving everyone together, is something I believe we all still carry inside us, even after decades of noise and speed and isolation. Do you remember that kind of silence? Not the cold silence of distance, but the warm silence of presence, the kind that made you feel safe just by knowing someone else was in the room. There were no buzzing phones, no constant updates, no endless interruptions. The home had a heartbeat, and everyone moved to it. Even the ordinary objects played their part in this quiet symphony of togetherness. The heavy wooden radio with its golden dial, the bookshelf filled with family albums and old magazines, the curtains that swayed gently whenever the door opened. The smell of something simmering slowly on the stove, promising comfort long before dinner was even served. Life didn't demand your attention, it invited it. And that invitation, that soft open door into a slower world, is what so many of us long for today, even if we rarely admit it out loud, because the truth is, we weren't just together back then. We were truly with one another, sharing space, sharing time, sharing the simple, sacred act of existing side by side without distraction. Maybe as you listen, you can feel a memory stirring, the weight of a blanket on your lap, the sound of someone humming in the next room, the faint scent of pine furniture or old books. Whatever comes up, hold it. This is your past speaking, your heart remembering what it once knew so well. And as we continue this journey, we'll dive deeper into these rituals, the ones that shaped not just a decade, but entire generations. Rituals that taught us how to love, how to wait, how to be present, and how to truly belong. If the weekdays in the 1950s carried their own quiet rhythm, then Sundays were something entirely different, almost sacred, as if the whole world paused just long enough for families to remember who they were. I don't think Sundays today feel anything like they used to. Back then, they had a kind of softness that embraced you the moment you opened your eyes. You could sense it in the air, in the stillness, in the way the sunlight filtered through the curtains with a gentler intention. Even the birds seemed to sing more slowly, as if they too recognized the day's importance. People didn't rush on Sundays. They didn't fill their schedules or chase productivity. There was an unspoken agreement across neighborhoods, across towns, that Sunday was a day for belonging. I remember waking up to the sound of my mother moving around the kitchen long before anyone else. Not in a hurried way, but in that peaceful, ritualistic manner that made everything she touched feel intentional. The scent of something baking, biscuits, cinnamon rolls or cornbread, would drift lazily through the house, mixing with the smell of warm butter and fresh coffee, and the kitchen. It felt almost holy on Sundays. The table covered with a cloth reserved for the day. The good plates laid out, each one with a tiny hand-painted flower on the rim. A vase with fresh-cut flowers from the yard, usually arranged with a tenderness that no store-bought bouquet could ever match. Families didn't need to be told to gather. They just did. It was as natural as the rising sun. There was something grounding about everyone moving through the same spaces, performing the same small actions, passing the butter, pouring the juice, sharing glances that said more than words ever could. Sunday breakfast wasn't merely a meal. It was a ritual of gratitude, a reminder that despite the struggles of the week, the world still had places of warmth. And after breakfast came the slow preparation for whatever the family's tradition was. Some dressed in their finest clothes for church, ironed shirts, polished shoes, dresses with soft pastel colors. Others stayed home, reading the newspaper from front to back, or sitting on the porch as the world moved quietly around them. No matter the ritual, Sundays carried one universal feeling: presence, full, unbroken presence, the kind of presence that came from a world without screens, where human faces and voices were the center of life. A world where the sound of your father clearing his throat or the rustle of the newspaper could fill an entire room with meaning. The afternoons were slow and generous. Children played outside, their laughter echoing down streets with almost no cars. Neighbors waved from their front yards. The breeze carried the faint smell of grass, warm soil, and distant barbecue fires starting up for the evening meal. And inside the house, oh, how peaceful it felt. The couch cushions still held the warmth of the morning. The radio played soft music, old ballads, gentle harmonies, songs that seemed to float through the air like memories waiting to be remembered. There was time to do nothing. And doing nothing wasn't a waste. It was nourishing. It was an act of caring for the soul. I remember lying on the living room rug, staring at the ceiling, feeling the sun move slowly across the room. You could track the whole afternoon just by watching the light shift from one wall to another. Maybe you remember moments like that too. Those rare instances when the world felt still enough for your own thoughts to finally speak. When the air carried a kind of kindness, as if the universe understood your need to rest. And as evening approached, families came together once again, almost instinctively. The table was set, the laughter grew louder, the stories flowed more freely. Sundays, in their quiet simplicity, taught us something that the modern world often forgets: that togetherness isn't built in grand moments, but in small, gentle rituals repeated week after week. They taught us to breathe, to slow down, to remember, to love without needing a reason. Even now, after so many years, I can close my eyes and feel a Sunday from the 1950s rise inside me like a warm tide. The softness, the slowness, the unmistakable sense of belonging. And perhaps, as you listen, you can feel your own memories stirring too, gentle, familiar, waiting patiently to be revisited. If mornings in the 1950s were gentle and Sundays were sacred, then evenings, oh, evenings were something else entirely. They carried a glow that lived not in the lamps or the fading sunlight, but in the people themselves. There was a particular moment, just after the sun dipped behind the rooftops, when the whole world seemed to exhale. A cool breeze would slip through the open windows, carrying with it the scent of cut grass, warm pavement, and distant dinners being prepared in neighboring homes. You could almost trace the entire neighborhood just by the smells in the air: A roast in one house, fried chicken in another, fresh bread rising somewhere down the street. And inside every home, as if guided by the same invisible conductor, families began their most intimate ritual: the gathering at the dinner table. Not the distracted, fragmented, half-present meals we often see today. This was different. This was a ceremony. One practiced daily, one that shaped the emotional architecture of the family. The table itself had a kind of presence, usually wooden, often slightly worn from years of elbows and laughter and late-night conversations. It wasn't perfect, far from it. There were scratches, marks, faded corners, but every imperfection was a story, a memory, a moment forever etched into the grain. I remember how the chairs creaked, softly, always the same familiar sound, when someone sat down, the clink of silverware being placed, the muted hum of the ceiling fan turning above, the warm light of a single lamp overhead casting a soft circle of gold across the table. In that light, faces looked gentler, eyes seemed warmer. Even the tiniest gestures held meaning. A hand passing a bowl, someone pouring water, the youngest child swinging their feet under the chair without quite reaching the floor. Dinner wasn't rushed. It unfolded slowly, like a conversation with time itself. People spoke, not to fill space, but to connect. Stories from the day, small frustrations, simple joys. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic, just life, spoken out loud, shared across plates and bowls, and the warm fragrance of a meal prepared with intention. And the food, it tasted different back then. Maybe not because of the ingredients, but because of the presence that surrounded it. Meals cooked from scratch, with hands that knew the value of time, with recipes passed down like whispered pieces of heritage. Children listened more closely. Adults spoke with more patience. There was a choreography to it all, a quiet, sacred rhythm that always brought the family back to center. Maybe you remember evenings like that. The way the room felt when everyone finally sat down together, the way the conversation drifted like soft music, rising and falling with the clatter of forks, and the gentle laughter of people who knew each other deeply. And then there was the silence, not an uncomfortable silence, but a contented one. A silence that meant, I'm here, you're here, and this moment is enough. Today, silence at the table feels rare. People reach for their phones, eyes drifting toward screens, minds scattered across 1,000 tiny digital worlds. But back then, the table was an island, a place where the rest of the world simply didn't exist. Even now, as I let these memories breathe inside me, I can almost hear the faint hum of distant cicadas outside the window, the gentle scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the soft warmth of lamplight settling over the room like a protective embrace. After dinner, no one rushed to leave. People lingered. Sometimes the conversation grew deeper, more thoughtful. Other times, the family simply sat quietly, absorbing the comfort of shared time. There was an understanding, a sacred truth almost everyone seemed to know instinctively. The day might be ending, but what really matters is here, now, around this table. And it's strange, isn't it, how something so simple could hold the power to shape a childhood, a family, an entire generation's sense of belonging. Perhaps that's why these memories come back with such force. Perhaps that's why our hearts tighten, just a little, when we think of those golden evenings, because they remind us of a world where connection wasn't an effort, it was a way of life. And as we move forward in this journey through forgotten rituals, we'll step deeper into these intimate moments, the ones that left soft footprints on the soul, the ones that made the 1950s not just a decade, but a feeling. There is a strange thing about memory. It rarely keeps the big events intact. Birthdays blur, holidays merge, but the small, unremarkable rituals, those stay. And the 1950s were full of them, tiny gestures woven into the fabric of everyday life, so ordinary at the time that no one imagined they would become priceless one day. Like the sound of a screen door slapping shut on a summer afternoon, or the way fathers would tap the side of the radio, trying to tune in a baseball game while pretending they weren't frustrated, or the soft creak of the staircase at night when a mother checked if everyone was asleep. These were not events. They were textures, textures of a life now gone. Evening walks around the neighborhood were among those forgotten rituals. Not for exercise, not for steps on a smartwatch, but because walking after dinner felt like the natural conclusion to a day. Families drifted along sidewalks, some with dogs trotting ahead, others with babies in strollers. Neighbors chatted, children ran in circles. The world felt slow enough that no one was in a hurry to get anywhere. And then there were the grocery trips, which somehow felt like miniature adventures. The smell of waxed floors, the metallic rattle of carts, little hands reaching for boxes with characters on them, mothers comparing produce with almost ceremonial seriousness. Every small detail, a quiet ritual, not photographed, not filmed, not shared online, just lived. Saturday mornings were another kind of magic, a weekly rebirth of the house itself. Sheets hung in the yard like white flags of truce between family and time. The scent of soap drifting across the lawn, someone sweeping the porch, someone mowing the grass, someone washing the family car with a bucket of warm water and the radio humming nearby. In the 1950s, life wasn't slower because people lacked technology. It was slower because they believed that every hour deserved to be felt. Nothing was disposable. Nothing was rushed. Life was a ceremony, and the ceremony lived inside tiny actions repeated over and over. And maybe the most powerful ritual of all was trust. People trusted their neighbors, trusted that doors didn't need to be locked, trusted that children could play outside until dark, trusted that tomorrow would look mostly like today, steady, familiar, safe. It wasn't perfect, but it was personal. Intimate, tangible. A world where every object had a story, every day had a rhythm. Every family, no matter how imperfect, believed they were building something that would last forever. They were wrong, of course. Nothing lasts forever. But the echoes do, and that is what we are listening to now. The echoes of small moments that once felt too ordinary to matter, yet ended up defining an entire generation. If the kitchen was the soul of the 1950s home, the living room was its heartbeat, steady, warm, and endlessly familiar. It wasn't just a room, it was a stage where the ordinary became sacred. In the evenings, families gravitated toward it almost instinctively, as though drawn by an invisible thread. The living room was where time softened, where the world outside slowed down just long enough to let people breathe. The furniture was simple by today's standards, a sofa that everyone agreed wasn't as comfortable as it looked, a coffee table with faint rings from glasses no one remembered placing, a lamp with a yellowish shade that poured a gentle, sleepy glow into the corners of the room. And then, of course, there was the television, the newcomer, the intruder, the miracle. For many families, the TV wasn't just an object, it was an event. Turning it on felt like opening a window into another universe. Children sat cross-legged on the carpet, leaning so close that mothers would scold them about ruining their eyes. Fathers adjusted the antenna with a seriousness usually reserved for major life decisions. A storm passing miles away could turn the screen into snow, and no one complained. They simply waited, trusting the world to settle again. Shows weren't just entertainment. They became weekly rituals. Everyone knew what night their favorite program aired. Everyone prepared for it. Popcorn in metal pots, blankets folded neatly. Conversations paused, as if the whole family silently agreed to suspend the chaos of life for 30 precious minutes. But the living room held more than laughter and bright screens. It held the quiet moments, too. The ones nobody talked about, but everyone remembers. A mother mending a shirt while humming softly. A father reading the newspaper with the patience of a man who believed the world wouldn't change faster than he could understand it. Siblings sharing the same blanket, pretending not to like it, but leaning just a little closer when the night felt cold. Sometimes someone would fall asleep on the couch, and instead of waking them, the others would tiptoe around, lower the volume, and preserve the silence as though it were a fragile thing. Because in the 1950s, silence was not awkward. It was natural, comfortable, a sign that everything was exactly as it should be. In that quiet glow of lamplight, in the flicker of black and white scenes, in the soft shuffle of slippers on hardwood floors, families weren't just passing time. They were bonding in ways too subtle for anyone to notice at the moment. It wasn't grand, it wasn't cinematic, it was human. And in that human simplicity lived a kind of warmth that our modern world barely remembers. Yet some part of us still longs for it, for a place where evenings had a predictable rhythm, where family gathered without negotiation, where connection didn't need to be scheduled. A time when a single room held everything that mattered. There was something unspoken about families in the 1950s, a kind of quiet agreement that didn't need to be written, explained, or defended. Everyone simply understood their place in the rhythm of the home, not out of obligation, but out of something softer, something woven from gentleness and routine. I remember how, in those days, people didn't measure love by the loudness of their words, but by the small things they did when no one was paying attention. A father warming his car early in the morning so his wife wouldn't step into the cold. A mother setting aside the last piece of pie because she knew it was her son's favorite. A sibling silently slipping their coat over the shoulders of another on a winter evening walk home. Love was quiet, subtle, almost shy. Maybe that's why it felt so profound. There were rules, not written on paper but carved gently into the fabric of everyday life. You never let someone eat alone if you could help it. You held the door a second longer than necessary. You didn't interrupt someone's story, even if you had already heard it 100 times. People cared about each other's comfort in ways that seem nearly foreign now. You didn't rush. You didn't cut corners. You didn't speak just to fill silence. And when someone asked how your day was, they actually listened. Their eyes soft, their hands resting quietly in their lap, their whole presence leaning toward you as though your words were a fragile gift. Looking back, I think togetherness in the 1950s was less about being in the same place and more about being emotionally available, fully, entirely present. There was an honesty in the way people interacted. No hidden motives, no performance, no fear of being misunderstood, just people being people, simple, imperfect, but always trying their best. Even disagreements felt different back then. When voices rose, they rose from caring too much, not from indifference. Arguments ended not with slammed doors, but with gentle reconciliations. A soft sigh, a hand on the shoulder, a quiet, "I didn't mean that." It was a time when forgiveness came easier than pride, when relationships were mended long before resentment had the chance to take root. And perhaps that is what made the era feel so undeniably warm. A warmth that wasn't tied to technology, comfort, or convenience, but to human nature itself. To the simple fact that people needed each other, trusted each other, and built their days around that shared understanding. Today, as I look back, I can still feel that softness, as if the world, for a brief moment in history, breathed a little slower, cared a little deeper, and loved without fear of being misunderstood. Those unwritten rules, they didn't just guide families, they shaped hearts. Mornings in the 1950s had a softness to them, a gentler beginning, as though the world itself believed that rushing was a kind of disrespect to the new day. I can still see it, how the light would creep in slowly, not with the harsh brightness of modern screens, but with the pale, almost sleepy glow that slipped through cotton curtains. It painted everything in pastels, gold, cream, soft blue, a reminder that the day wasn't something to conquer, but something to welcome. You woke up to sounds that felt human, The low hum of a refrigerator, the tick-tock of a wall clock, the clinking of a spoon stirring sugar into a porcelain cup. Coffee brewing wasn't just a smell, it was an atmosphere, a signal to the entire house that life was beginning again. Children shuffled through hallways with bed-warm feet. Mothers tied aprons around their waists without thinking twice. A motion so automatic it seemed passed down through blood memory, and fathers stepped outside to fetch the morning paper, breathing in crisp air that carried the scent of dew on cut grass. Nobody checked messages. Nobody scrolled through headlines in bed. The world waited patiently until you chose to meet it. There was something sacred in that. Breakfast wasn't rushed. It wasn't eaten standing or in the car or between tasks. It was a ritual, a small gathering before lives drifted into separate paths for the day, toast with real butter, eggs made on a cast-iron skillet that had seen more mornings than anyone could count, fresh milk poured into glasses with tiny bubbles that clung to the rim. Sometimes there were pancakes, sometimes there was silence. Both felt meaningful. And always, always, there was time. Time to sit, time to think, time to exist without urgency. Parents talked about simple things: the weather, a neighbor's garden, a dress that needed mending, a child's schoolwork. Nothing dramatic, nothing overwhelming. Just life, unfolding gently across the table. Even the walk to school or work had a different rhythm. Streets were quieter, cars moved slower, people waved to one another because it felt strange not to. You could hear your own footsteps. You could hear the wind. And in that quiet, you had space to feel alive, to notice the small things, the details that today are so easily lost beneath layers of noise. When I think back on those mornings, I don't remember schedules or responsibilities or stress. I remember warmth and light, and the feeling that life somehow wasn't something passing by me, but something I was gently walking through. A companion. Not an enemy, a melody, not a countdown. Those slow mornings, they taught us how to breathe. And sometimes, when the world feels too loud now, I close my eyes and try to return to that soft beginning, where the day unfolded like a well-loved photograph slowly coming to life in a tray of warm developer. Evenings in the 1950s had a way of settling into the skin like a warm blanket after a long day, soft, familiar, unhurried. And if there was one place where the world felt perfectly balanced, it was the front porch. The porch wasn't just part of the house. It was an extension of the family, a space where life unfolded in slow motion, where the line between private and public blurred gently like the twilight on the horizon. I can still hear it. The creak of the wooden boards under bare feet, the rhythmic rocking of a chair that had seen decades of seasons, the distant laughter of children finishing their last game before the sun dipped below the rooftops. There was a kind of ceremony in gathering outside as evening settled in. Fathers loosened their ties, mothers let their shoulders relax. Children sprawled across steps, still warm from the day's sunlight. And the air had that unmistakable scent of cut grass, cooling pavement, and the faintest hint of someone's dinner drifting down the street. Neighbors didn't need invitations, they didn't need warnings. They just wandered over, casually, naturally, as though drawn by a magnetic pull that only existed in that era. Conversations were slow, measured, unforced. People spoke about gardens, about baseball scores, about a new car someone down the block had bought. Nothing urgent, nothing heavy enough to cloud the peace. Children caught fireflies in glass jars and held them like tiny lanterns, their palms glowing gold as if they were carrying pieces of the sun that refused to go to sleep. Sometimes someone would bring out a radio, its warm static humming like a heartbeat against the night. Music floated into the darkness, soft jazz, gentle crooners, songs about longing and hope and the quiet ache of being alive. Even the darkness felt different then. It didn't threaten, it didn't hide, it embraced. a deep velvet cocoon studded with stars that seem brighter than the ones we see today. Maybe because we actually looked at them, maybe because we let ourselves. Some nights, storms rolled in from a distance. You could see the sky flashing far away, like someone flicking on a giant cosmic light behind thick curtains. The wind would shift, chimes would tremble, people would pull their chairs closer but stay exactly where they were, talking, listening, existing together in the shared breath of evening. It was in those porch nights that families talked about things that mattered, dreams, fears, memories, the quiet truths that only appear when the world around you softens enough to let honesty through. And sometimes no one spoke at all. People simply sat, together. Comfortable in silence, because silence was not something to fix, but something to feel. Looking back, I realized the front porch wasn't just a structure. It was a ritual, a sanctuary, a threshold between two worlds, the one inside the home and the one out in the open air. And for a moment each evening, those worlds touched, and life felt perfectly, achingly whole. Families in the 1950s were bound together not by spoken promises, but by threads so subtle you could easily mistake them for ordinary moments. Yet those small, ordinary moments were the glue that kept everything from falling apart. I remember how every family seemed to have its own rhythm, a private pulse, a set of gestures and habits that outsiders rarely noticed, but insiders felt deeply. There was the way a mother would tap twice on the kitchen counter when dinner was ready, not calling out, not shouting, just a gentle sound that somehow traveled through every room. The way a father cleared his throat before sharing news, good or bad, not dramatic, but steady, as if signaling to the room that he was doing his best to carry a world heavier than he let on. The way siblings invented languages only they understood, a glance, a nudge, a shared smirk that translated to a full conversation without a single word exchanged. These were the invisible rituals, not birthdays, not holidays, not the big gatherings that lived in photo albums, but the tiny ones, the ones that lived in the seams between sunlight and shadow. A daughter braiding her mother's hair on Sunday afternoons. A son polishing his father's shoes, not because he was told to, but because he wanted to make him proud. Grandparents telling the same story for the 10th, 20th, 50th time, and nobody interrupting, because repetition was part of the magic. And then there were the unspoken acts of protection. Parents standing a little closer when a stranger passed by on the sidewalk. A mother placing her hand discreetly on her child's back in crowded places. A silent promise. You are safe. People didn't call it affection. They didn't analyze it. They didn't post about it. They simply lived it. And we, as children, absorbed those gestures like air, invisible, essential, taken for granted until years later, when we realized their significance. I think about the way families walked together. There was always someone slightly ahead, someone in the middle, someone trailing behind, like a small constellation moving through the world with a sense of belonging. Even disagreements followed a ritual. Voices might rise, but doors rarely slammed. Apologies appeared in gestures. A cup of tea placed quietly on a table, a repaired toy left at the foot of a bed, a hand resting briefly on a shoulder at dusk. Forgiveness was not a performance. It was a slow, tender thing, woven into actions rather than declarations, and perhaps the most beautiful ritual of all was the way families said goodnight. Lights dimming one by one, the house settling into silence, footsteps soft on wooden floors, and the faint echo of "sleep tight" floating through the hallway. There was safety in that phrase, warmth, continuity, the promise that tomorrow would begin together just as today had ended together. Looking back, I realized those invisible threads were more powerful than any grand gesture or celebration. They were proof that love didn't need to be loud to be real. It only needed to be consistent, woven quietly into the fabric of everyday life. And even now, decades later, I can still feel those threads pulling at my memory, reminding me that the simplest moments were the strongest ones, the ones that shaped who we became, the ones we spend a lifetime trying to return to. Saturdays in the 1950s weren't just days of the week. They were a world of their own, a small universe where time stretched like warm taffy pulled slowly between gentle hands. You could feel it the moment you woke up. The air was different, less structured, less expectant, as though the entire town exhaled at the same time. The sun always seemed a little kinder on Saturdays, not blazing, not hurried, but soft and dreamy, as if it too had decided to take things slow. Saturday mornings had a special soundtrack, the distant hum of lawnmowers, the click of a bicycle chain being oiled, the splashing of soapy water as someone washed their car in the driveway. These sounds weren't noise. They were comfort. They were the heartbeat of the neighborhood. Children roamed in loose groups, not checking watches, not texting to coordinate, just following the pull of curiosity and the promise of adventure. A ball bouncing on the sidewalk, a skipping rope slapping pavement, roller skates clicking on cracked concrete. Those were the invitations of childhood. And every street had its regulars. Mr. Thompson sweeping his porch with the same slow circular motions he'd been using for decades. Mrs. Adler tending to her roses in a wide-brimmed hat, hands gentle as though touching something sacred. People weren't rushing, they weren't multitasking, they weren't thinking about productivity, they were simply living. Families often went shopping together, a ritual wrapped in excitement and simple pleasures. Stepping into a store felt like entering another little world. The jingle of the doorbell, the smell of fresh bread, the glimmer of glass jars filled with candies lined up like tiny jewels. Children pressed their noses against soda shop counters while adults compared fabrics, running their fingers over textures as if choosing cloth was an art form. And in those days, it was. Time seemed to flow differently, slower, kinder, more generous. Even chores had a kind of poetry, bed sheets billowing on the clothesline, their edges glowing in the sunlight. The rhythmic sweep of a broom across a front porch, the metallic clink of tools as fathers tuned up lawnmowers with quiet dignity. And in the middle of all this simplicity, families found themselves together in ways they didn't even think about. A child handing their mother clothespins, a father lifting his daughter onto his shoulders for a better view, siblings perched side by side on the edge of the curb, legs dangling, sharing a bottle of soda without arguing over whose turn it was. Afternoons drifted like lazy clouds. Some napped, some read. Some sat outside and just listened to the wind rustling trees as if nature had its own language. And as the day faded into golden hour, that soft, honey-colored light that made every surface glow, you could feel the entire world slowing down even further. Saturday wasn't a break from life. It was life. Life in its gentlest, truest, most unadorned form. A reminder that joy didn't live in grand moments or big plans, but in the small, steady rituals woven quietly into the fabric of ordinary days. Sometimes, when I close my eyes now, I can still feel it. The warmth of the sidewalk beneath my feet, the hum of distant chatter, the soft laughter echoing from open windows. A whole lifetime lived in a single Saturday that seemed to last forever. Nights in the 1950s carried a kind of magic that didn't need neon lights or late-night television or endless distractions to make them feel alive. They were quieter, but somehow so much fuller. I remember how darkness arrived slowly. A tender descent, as if the sky were pulling a soft blanket over the earth. Street lamps flickered on one by one, their golden halos pooling gently on the pavement, not harsh, not bright, just enough to guide your steps and warm your heart. Back then, the world after sunset felt almost sacred. Children knew the meaning of "be home before dark," not because the night was frightening, but because the transition itself, That moment when day slipped into evening was a ritual families shared. You could hear screen doors closing with their familiar metallic clap, the universal signal that it was time to gather in, time to settle the day, time to reconnect. Inside, the house seemed to shift too. Lights dimmed, shadows lengthened, rooms grew softer, more intimate, as if they exhaled after holding their breath all day. There was something comforting about the glow of a single lamp in a quiet living room, a warm island of light in a sea of dusk. Families found themselves drawn to these small circles of illumination, like moths gathering around a flame that didn't burn but healed. Some evenings were filled with stories, not stories read from books, but stories carried in memories, fragile, humorous, sometimes bittersweet. A father telling his children about his own childhood mischief, a mother sharing a moment from years before they were born, grandparents recounting tales so old they felt like folklore. And the children, they listened, not half distracted, not impatient, but with wide eyes and open hearts, as though every word were a treasure being passed down. Other nights were spent with board games, their pieces worn smooth from decades of touch, the dice rolling like tiny thunder on a wooden table. Laughter rose and fell in gentle waves, the kind of laughter that made time slow down and sit beside you. And then there were the nights of almost complete silence, the kind where the only sounds were the soft hum of a radio, the turning of pages as someone read, or the distant bark of a dog half a block away. Silence wasn't empty back then. It was comforting, a companion, a space where thoughts could settle like dust floating in a beam of light. Sometimes families stepped outside just to see the stars. Back then the sky was darker, the constellations clearer, as if the universe itself leaned a little closer. Children traced shapes in the sky with curious fingers, and parents followed their gaze, rediscovering the awe they'd forgotten they once felt. And there were moments, tiny, fleeting, that imprinted themselves onto the soul. A mother, brushing her daughter's hair while humming softly. A father carrying a sleepy child to bed, their head resting on his shoulder like a small, warm promise. Siblings whispering secrets under shared blankets, flashlights flickering like tiny stars of their own. These were the rituals of night, not loud, not spectacular, but deeply human, the kind of moments that stitched families together in ways no one talked about, yet everyone felt. Looking back now, I realize the nights didn't just end the day, they healed it. They softened its edges. They reminded us that we were safe, that we belonged, that home wasn't just a place. It was a feeling, a warmth, a light, a quietness that wrapped itself around your heart and whispered, "You're not alone." Time has a strange way of folding in on itself. The rituals of the 1950s, those small, quiet movements of domestic life, have long faded from the homes where they once lived. But they have not disappeared, not entirely. They survive in fragments, in echoes, in the way someone still smooths the edge of a tablecloth before dinner, in the way a grandfather still whistles a familiar tune while stepping into the backyard, in the way a mother still insists that everyone sits together, even if only for a few minutes, even if the world outside is pulling them in 1,000 different directions. The rituals survived not because they were perfect, but because they were human, because they were built not on wealth, not on technology, not on convenience, but on presence. And presence is timeless. Even now, decades later, you can step into a quiet kitchen late at night with a single lamp glowing above the sink and feel something ancient stirring, something familiar, something that does not belong to this century or the last, but to the emotional architecture of being alive. A reminder that life is not measured by the storms it endures, but by the small, warm lights that keep the darkness at bay. The families of the 1950s did not know they were living in a fragile world. They did not see themselves as guardians of a disappearing ritual. They did not imagine that the rhythms of their days would one day be studied, romanticized, mourned. To them, life was simply life, complicated, ordinary, imperfect, beautiful, and maybe that is the greatest lesson they left behind. Not the aesthetics of the era, not the televisions or the cars or the pastel colors of suburban kitchens, but the idea, profound in its simplicity, that connection is built quietly over time in rituals so small they are almost invisible. A father turning off the porch light at night, a mother whispering goodnight at a bedroom door, a child placing their school shoes neatly by the steps, a grandmother folding laundry with slow, patient hands. These moments were never meant to be extraordinary, but taken together, they formed the emotional backbone of an entire generation. And maybe, if we look closely, they can still form ours. Because even in a world that moves too fast, even in a world drowning in noise, even in a world where rituals are often replaced by screens and notifications and endless urgency, there is still room for the sacred. There is still room for the slow. There is still room for the warm, human patterns that remind us who we are. The families of the 1950s are gone now. Their neighborhoods have changed, their kitchens have changed, their world has changed. But the feeling, the quiet, golden warmth of a home that breathes with its own steady rhythm, remains waiting for anyone willing to reclaim it. In the end, the rituals everyone forgot were never truly lost. They were simply waiting. Waiting for us to remember that beneath every era, beneath every war, every invention, every cultural shift, there is something deeper, the eternal human longing to gather, to share space, to belong, to love, to be loved, and to build a place where life in all its fragile beauty can unfold gently. So tonight, as you turn off the lights, as you prepare for another day, as you move through your own quiet rituals, know this. You are part of a story that began long before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. A story written not in grand gestures, but in the soft glow of a lamp, the closing of a door, the warmth of a familiar voice, and the memory of a world where life was slower, simpler, and somehow closer. This is not just how life was in the 1950s. This is how life can be even now, if we choose to remember. And sometimes remembering is all it takes.